All right, let's dive right into the incredibly complex and, frankly, completely misunderstood legacy of America's 29th president, Warren G. Harding. We're going to unpack a presidency that usually just gets reduced to a single, scandalous footnote in the history books and actually look at the data. Because the historical record, it tells a much, much more nuanced story. So, was he really America's worst president? I mean, history often dismisses him as a total failure, right? Or just this dim-witted figurehead. But we're going to impartially explore the surprising achievements and the devastating scandals of his time in office to get to the truth. Because when you strip away the generalized reputation and look at the primary sources, you find a leader who successfully navigated a severe economic depression, championed bold civil rights in a deeply divided era, and yet completely failed to manage the corruption happening right under his own nose. In this explainer, we'll be covering, first, a return to normalcy. Second, diplomacy and disarmament. Third, a bold civil rights stance. Fourth, the Ohio gang scandals. And finally, we'll be reassessing Harding's legacy.
Okay, Section 1, a return to normalcy, rolling back the progressive era. Harding actually swept into office right after the really tumultuous years of World War I, and he did it by promising the American people a soothing return to what he called normalcy. You see, he fundamentally believed the nation didn't need heroics or progressive experimentation. In his own words, he said America needed healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration. After the massive growth of federal power, taxation, and regulation under Woodrow Wilson during the Great War, Harding wanted to bring back free enterprise and significantly shrink government involvement. And you know what? This number brilliantly illustrates his appeal. He won the 1920 popular vote by a massive 26.2 percentage points. Just imagine a modern presidential election being won by over 26 points. It's literally unthinkable today. That is the largest popular vote margin in presidential elections since the end of the era of good feelings, all the way back in the 1820s. Basically, the American public was exhausted by wartime sacrifice, and they fully embraced Harding's calming, hands-off approach. When he took office, the country was right in the middle of a severe economic depression. So working closely with his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, who was essentially the very first supply-side tax cutter, Harding implemented a really strict agenda. They passed the Revenue Act of 1921, drastically cutting taxes, particularly for the wealthy, to spur investment. They also enacted the highly protectionist Ford-Macumber tariff to shield American manufacturing, and crucially, Harding signed the Budget and Accounting Act. This created the very first formal federal budget and actually reduced absolute non-military spending. Instead of government intervention, he relied on flexible market prices to just let wages and supply adjust naturally. And guess what? It worked. The economy recovered strongly into a period of massive growth. But Harding wasn't just looking inward. That brings us to Section 2, Diplomacy and Naval Disarmament, Securing the Pacific. So in terms of foreign policy, rather than joining the League of Nations, Harding sought out multilateral treaties to secure world peace, and his administration orchestrated a major proactive victory by convening the Washington Naval Conference. This brought together major world powers like Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. His Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, absolutely shocked the world by immediately proposing the scrapping of dozens of warships. This successfully halted a brewing global arms race in capital ships. In fact, as one journalist at the time noted, Hughes sank more ships in 35 minutes than all the admirals of the world had sunk in centuries. It was a massive deal. Moving on to Section 3, a bold civil rights stance, the Birmingham speech. Now, this is fascinating. During an era of severe racial intolerance, not to mention the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, Harding took actions that completely shocked the nation. In the fall of 1921, he became the very first sitting president to visit the Deep South since the Civil War. He spoke at Birmingham's semi-centennial celebration to a crowd of over 30,000 Alabamians. About a third of that audience was black, but the crowd was strictly separated by skin color with a literal zigzagging wire fence. And Harding used this massive platform not to placate the South, but to advocate openly for black economic, educational, and political equality. He looked out at the crowd and delivered these exact, powerful words. Let the black man vote when he is fit to vote, and prohibit the white man voting when he is unfit to vote. The reaction was, as you might expect, highly polarized. These statements were met with stony, absolute silence from the white audience. But from the other side of that wire fence, uproarious applause from the black attendees.
Faced with the total silence of the white crowd, a visibly angry Harding actually departed from his script, pointedly telling them that unless democracy is a lie, they must recognize that equality.
And this wasn't just some one-off speech. Harding actively reversed the segregationist policies that Woodrow Wilson had installed in the federal civil service. Earlier that same year, literally just days after the horrific Tulsa race massacre, he made an unprecedented trip to give a commencement address at Lincoln University, a black institution in Pennsylvania, and he personally shook the hand of every single black graduate. He also supported an anti-lynching bill in Congress. Now, while he did stop short of advocating for total social equality or intermarriage, which really reflects the limitations of his era, his willingness to push for basic democratic rights earned praise from prominent black leaders like Wendell Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. It is a stark reminder that history is rarely black and white. Here is a president largely remembered for failure, making incredibly progressive strides for basic democratic rights.
Which leads us to Section 4, the Ohio Gang Scandals, a Legacy Unravels. All right, here's where the narrative really shifts. Because no matter how positive his civil rights bravery or economic policies were, Harding was a notoriously poor judge of character. He surrounded himself with what became known as the Ohio Gang, friends and political allies from his home state who, frankly, operated exactly like that name suggests. They actively exploited their federal positions for personal wealth. Shortly before and then immediately after Harding's sudden death from a heart attack in August 1923, a whole series of mini-mysteries and congressional investigations began to unravel. Contrasting these two monumental betrayals of public trust really shows you the spectrum of corruption that totally dominated headlines for the rest of the decade. On one hand, we have the infamous corporate greed of the Teapot Dome scandal. Interior Secretary Albert Fall actually convinced Harding to transfer naval oil reserves to his department, and then he secretly leased them out to private oil companies without any competitive bidding, just blatant corruption. But then, on the other hand, we see the sheer, inexcusable cruelty of the Veterans Bureau scandal. Director Charles Forbes had a massive budget meant to build hospitals for 300,000 wounded World War I veterans. Instead of helping the people who had literally sacrificed for their country, he just looted the budget. The anatomy and the sheer scale of this graft was completely unprecedented. Get this. Albert Fall received $85,000 and a herd of cattle from Sinclair Oil for the Teapot Dome lease in Wyoming. Yes, a literal herd of cattle as a bribe. He also took a little black bag containing $100,000 from Edward Doheny for the Elk Hills lease in California. Forbes, meanwhile, made an absolute fortune by inflating hospital construction costs and selling off vital government medical supplies to his friends at absurdly low rates. He basically defrauded the taxpayer of an estimated $225 million. And we can't forget the Justice Department, where an Associate Attorney General Harry Daugherty was just selling off pardons and illegal liquor withdrawal permits. Ultimately, the consequences did catch up with them. Albert Fall made history, but for all the wrong reasons. He became the first presidential cabinet member ever to be sent to prison. Finally, Section 5, Reassessing Harding's Legacy, the final verdict. So how do we reconcile all those diplomatic and civil rights successes with this devastating systemic corruption? Well, extensive congressional investigations ultimately proved that Harding himself was not personally involved in the bribery or the kickbacks. He didn't take a single dime. But his tragic flaw was an absolute inability to exhibit strong leadership over his own friends. By empowering the Ohio Gang and basically turning a blind eye until it was way too late, his historical standing was completely ruined. As we've seen, Warren G. Harding was a man of considerable, often totally forgotten gifts. He oversaw incredible economic growth and bravely spoke hard truths about race in the deeply segregated South. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. When judging a presidency, does a leader's positive vision matter more than the catastrophic failures of the people they empower? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the historical record and keep learning.